Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Straightforward topic. Let's learn. What's the most horrific disaster that almost no one has ever heard of? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. The Kansas City Hyatt Skywalk collapse, which I had never heard of until the podcast Swindle did an episode on it. It was a big open dance party in the lobby of a hotel with thousands in attendance, and the new Skywalk completely gave out. The whole scene sounds horrific. Amputations on site with kitchen knives and chainsaws, flooding, threatening, drowning, and electrocution during the rescue operations. Just nuts. Engineering on the Skywalks were ineptitude mixed with wishful thinking. The Galveston, Texas hurricane of 1900. By some estimates, over 10,000 people were killed at a time when the population of the country was about 75 million. Per capita, it was deadlier than the Vietnam or Korean Wars. It's almost forgotten now, but the Teni Airport disaster in 1977 was and is still the deadliest air disaster in the world. It involved two 747s. One, KLM, the other from Pan Am, collided on the runway in dense fog during the KLM flight's takeoff run, and the Pan Am flight was still on the runway. There was something like only 61 survivors and 583 killed. The most horrific racing crash was at Le Mans in 1955. 84 dead, 120 injured, when Pierre Lavay's Mercedes careened into the crowd next to the track across from uncontrolled pits. The race continued, largely due to the traffic jam that would be caused by red flagging it. Mercedes withdrew and didn't return to racing for over 30 years. The Aban Disaster, which buried a primary school full of children and teachers in coal slurry. The Aban Disaster was a catastrophic collapse of a colliery spoil tip on 21 October 1966. The tip had been created on a mountain slope above the Welsh village of Aberfan, near Merthyr Tydfil, and overlaid a natural spring. Heavy rain led to a buildup of water with the tip, which caused it to suddenly slide downhill as a slurry, killing 116 children and 28 adults as it engulfed Pantglas Junior High School and a row of houses. The tip was the responsibility of the National Coal Board, NCB, and a subsequent inquiry placed the blame for the disaster on the organization and 9 named employees. Young people might not be aware of it, but the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami that killed 280,000 people was pretty bad. It affected multiple countries. Cherry, Illinois mine disaster happened in 1909 and 259 men and boys died. Town no longer exists, and a rock with a plaque and a roadside marker is all that remains. The Eastland disaster. SS Eastland rolled over while still tied to the dock in downtown Chicago in July of 1915. 844 people died. The Johnston flood, which was caused by some of the most powerful men in the U.S. at the time and their South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Henry Clay Frick led a group of Pittsburgh speculators, including Benjamin Ruff, to purchase the abandoned reservoir, modify it, and convert it into a private resort lake for their wealthy associates. Many were connected through business and social links to Carnegie Steel. Development included lowering the dam to make its top wide enough to hold a road and putting a fish screen in the spillway. Workers lowered the dam, which had been 72 feet, 22 meters high by 3 feet, 0.91 meters, 10. These alterations are thought to have increased the vulnerability of the dam. Moreover, a system of relief pipes and valves, features of the original dam, which had previously been sold off for scrap, were not replaced, so the club had no way of lowering the water level in the lake in case of an emergency. After multiple days of rainfall, the dam breached and flooded multiple towns and killing 2,209 people, making the disaster the largest loss of civilian life in the U.S. at the time. In 1974, Jolma building fire in downtown Sao Paulo, an air conditioning unit overheated and caught fire rapidly, engulfing the building, over 150 plus dead and 300 injured. The Coconut Grove Fire was a nightclub fire which took place in Boston, Massachusetts on November 28, 1942, and resulted in the deaths of 492 people. It is the deadliest nightclub fire in history, and the second deadliest single building fire, after the Iroquois theater fire. This incident spawned many burn treatment techniques. The 1975 Bangkok Dam Failure. Poor engineering, poor construction, and a typhoon resulted in the Bangkok Dam and 61 other downstream collapsing. It flooded 30 cities, affected 10 million people, and killed between 26 and 240,000 people. Wow. The Chinese government hid the incident, and it was completely unknown in the West until the 90s. They only declassified it in 2005. The Beverly Hills Supper Club fire in 1977 in northern Kentucky. 165 people were killed. It helped usher in new fire codes and regulations. Issues involved no sprinkler system, no smoke detectors, no emergency lighting, exit doors blocked, overcrowding, flammable fabrics, and no notification system. I was very young, but I do remember hearing about it on the news. Another just up the road about 5 miles in Cincinnati was the Who concert in '79. 11 people were crushed to death storming the doors. It impacted and banned general admission concerts in the region for years. Gasoline explosions in the sewer system of Guadalajara, Alisco, April 22, 1992. National Geographic did a show on it, and it was absolutely bullshit reporting. Mexican Petroleums, or Pemex, dumped thousands of gallons in the sewer system, trying to cover accounting fraud. Government officially reported 400 dead. I was a rescue worker and investigative reporter. We counted at least 11,000 dead. I hate corruption. The Summerland disaster on the Isle of Man in 1973. Truly horrific fire incident that killed 50 people at a leisure center. I remember it in the newspaper at the time, but the details absolutely beggar belief. The levels of incompetence mixed with happenstance are one of the major lessons that fire safety, as important as it is today in the UK. It changed everything. The Station nightclub fire in 2003. Great White was playing. There was pyro, and it caught the acoustic foam ceiling on fire. 100 people died and almost 300 injured. The guy with the band who lit the pyro went to prison. The foam stuff was not up to code, but they hadn't been fined or anything when they had been inspected. It was an avoidable disaster. I'm using the name disaster liberally, but I was going to say the Taiping Rebellion. Hardly anyone in the Western world knows about it, especially given how incredibly destructive and deadly it was, with 20 to 30 million dead and large swaths of China destroyed. The England Rongluk, English misfortune, on the Schadensland mountain in the Black Forest in 1936. An English schoolteacher took a group of 27 pupils aged 12 to 17 up a mountain despite warnings of an incoming storm. They got lost and had to be rescued by locals, but 5 pupils died. The rescue efforts and hospitality of the local Hitler youth were vaunted as propaganda by the Nazi government. I only learned about this when I moved to the city of Freiburg, which the mountain overlooks, a few years ago. There's a small monument up there still. Boston Molasses Disaster of 1919. 12,000 metric tons of molasses flooded the streets after a storage tank exploded. It only had around 20 recorded deaths, but the death count isn't a scary part. You know how sticky and slow molasses is? Can you imagine getting stuck in it? How hard it would be to rescue someone without getting trapped yourself? Some of the victims who drowned or died were covered in it, so it was hard to identify the bodies, not to mention that the smell lingered for years afterwards. Air Florida Flight 90. I lived in DC and I was 12 at the time. The footage of the flight attendant swimming in the icy Potomac River among the wreckage and debris of the airplane is embedded in my brain. As I recall, an onlooker jumped in to help her. Behind the Bastards did a couple episodes on the Hawk's Nest Tunnel Project, which I had never heard of. The TLDR is that the company running it was just throwing people at it, mostly poor and/or minorities, even though they knew the silica dust being kicked up in the tunnel was extremely toxic and dangerous. Hundreds, maybe thousands, died, basically the silica equivalent of black lung, some in as little as a couple of months after they started working. Los Alfaques Disaster, Alcanar, Spain, 1978. A tanker truck overloaded with pressurized flammable gas ruptured next to a beach campsite resort. The gas spread through the resort and then ignited, creating a fuel air bomb which instantly killed 215 people and severely burned hundreds more. In New England, King Philip's War was devastating, yet I never heard a word about it in school despite living in that area. It had happened. It's one of the worst, if not the worst, war in colonial American history. America might be a very different place if the settlers hadn't pulled through. One ironic part to me is how a spot in Sudbury, Massachusetts on 27, where a Whole Foods now sits, is the location of a massive massacre of civilians. The Erfurt Latrine Disaster. On the morning of 26 July, the combined weight of the assembled nobles caused the wooden second-story floor of the building to collapse, and most of them fell through into the latrine cesspit below the ground floor, where about 60 of them drowned in liquid excrement. United Airlines Flight 232 crashed landing in 1989. They lost an engine and had to crash land at the airport in Sioux City, Iowa. 112 people died, although it is apparently considered one of the more successful crash landing situations. My dad worked for a lumber company in Sioux City at the time. He said for weeks they just made coffins to send people home in. The HMT Rona was a British passenger ship used as a troop transport. It was sunk by a German glide bomb, killing 1,200 people, including almost 1,000 U.S. servicemen, including my great-uncle. It was covered up so the Germans wouldn't hear about the success of the attack, and was forgotten for 50 years. Well, if you didn't already know, there's a really good film about it called Alive, so if you wanted to look it up and check it out, I'd recommend it. It's good. There's also a book which would probably be much more in-depth, but if you have a slightly shorter attention span, that could also get it done. I only recently learned about the Andes plane crash in the 70s. I don't want to look up the story right now to avoid ruining my currently good mood, but from my memory, the plane crashed in the cold mountain in South America, and the victims resorted to cannibalism to survive as long as they did. They ate the dead victims' bodies. The survivors were stuck on the mountain for 2 months or so before being found. Even sadder was that once they were rescued, their societies heavily criticized them for the cannibalism, like mild criticism. It's so easy to judge them when you're not the one fighting for your life against injuries from the crash, extreme cold weather, and starvation. Very sad for the victims that died and the survivors who had to make those tough choices and face judgment. I initially read the question as disease, so people in the modern developed world have no idea how horrifying cholera outbreaks are. Cholera is a disease spread through the fecal-oral route. Bacteria from someone's poop gets into your gut, most often because a water source is contaminated. Once the bacteria reaches your intestine, as quickly as 12 hours after exposure, the diarrhea starts. You may vomit too, but you're going to have horrible diarrhea. How horrible? Gallons. Up to 5 gallons of diarrhea a day. The bacteria essentially jams on the eject button in your bowels. Someone with cholera pretty rapidly runs out of feces, but they will continue to squirt out watery, grayish diarrhea. Some modern strains are so nasty that you die of dehydration within hours of symptoms starting. You can be perfectly healthy and then literally shit yourself to death within hours. Today, cholera is easy to treat. All it takes is medical monitoring, clean water, and some salt and sugar. But cholera doesn't happen in places where there's clean water. It happens in places like Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, where over 4,000 people died within months of an earthquake. In 1854, a cholera outbreak in London gave rise to modern epidemiology, and also killed 127 people in one neighborhood in 3 days. That's people who were healthy, and within 3 days, got sick and died. Any cholera outbreak is, by definition, horrible. One such disaster that is often overlooked in history is the 1950 Red River flood in North Vietnam. This devastating event is not widely known globally, but had a profound impact locally. Due to a combination of heavy rainfall and a series of typhoons, the Red River, which runs through Hanoi and other densely populated areas, overflowed. This led to catastrophic flooding, causing widespread destruction of homes and farmland. Estimates suggest that around 1,000 to 2,000 people lost their lives and hundreds of thousands were left homeless. The flood also led to a severe famine, exacerbating the suffering. The Who concert in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1979, where 11 people died and others injured from getting crushed by the crowd surge or falling and being trampled to death. There were no assigned seats, so when some of the glass doors holding the crowd back were broken, People rushed in to get the best seats. The show went on as scheduled, as this happened in the hallway outside the main arena, and the injured and dead people were just taken away from the building.